So we just talked about three different ways that we hold agencies accountable. And we talked about fiscal, and process, and program accountabilities. These are the ways that we generally think of, the general categories that we think of for holding agencies accountable. And as I talked about before, accountability is difficult because at the core, we want to make sure that the government is doing its job properly. And elected officials have the power to instruct agencies how to do their job. But they don't generally want a clear chain of accountability because it makes them more accountable in return. In a system of accountability, citizens give power to representatives, representatives give power to agencies through the law, then they hold those agencies accountable, and then citizens hold their representatives or elected officials accountable. Now, when elected officials start doing things that are inappropriate by directing agencies to do things that they are not supposed to do, this becomes very difficult for administrators because administrators have internal processes. So administrators inside agencies, they have internal processes. They've set up systems of accountability. They've set up systems of delegated authority inside the bureaucracy and the hierarchy. So as they do that, we have processes that are in place to make sure that the agencies are accountable. We also have people watching over the agencies, like external oversight, for example, watchdog groups, elected officials, and then also every member of an agency is part of a profession. So for example, I'm a professor. I belong to the American Society of American Society of Political Science, American Political Science Association. I could belong to the Association of Planners. I could belong to a fraternal order of police, fraternity, but also there's some professional standards of what it's like to be a police officer. Now, all these people who are doing the job of government have to comply with external oversight through elected officials or watchdog groups. They have to be held accountable to the law directly. They're held accountable to the internal systems inside their agency to make sure that they're doing their job properly. And then they also have accountability to their profession. So if I were to do something that violates a professional norm for a professor, I would not be able to find a job somewhere else as a professor again. So it's not just internal to Cal State Fullerton, for example, where I'm at. I have to follow and be accountable to those, but I also have to be accountable to these other norms. This makes it really, really difficult as we try to hold people accountable because there might be some competing norms or pressures. For example, internally, the system might suggest that you have to be accountable in a specific way, but external oversight and accountability may be contrary to the direction of your internal organization. Now, because of this focus on accountability inside government, it slows individuals from taking bold action. It deters people who have bright, big, new ideas from coming to work in the public sector because there's so much focus on delegated authority and accountability that there's no incentive to try something brand new because it risks pushing beyond what we're allowed to do or violate some accountability standard. And especially when we talk about higher risk actions, like let's say, for example, we could solve some problem and has an 80% chance of success, but the 20% weighs so heavily in our mind because it would violate some accountability norm inside our organization that we just simply don't try it. And so this becomes really difficult, and this is part of the reason why governments function so differently than the private sector. Now, if an individual inside a public organization sees that their organization is becoming unaccountable, either to some professional norms or to internal routine processes or to external oversight or to maybe they're not even doing their mission anymore. I imagine like the EPA during some presidents where the president more or less said, I hate the EPA, I'm not going to follow what it does, I'm going to change the EPA's rules so it's easier on pollution and all these things. There are faithful environmental professionals who would say, that is so against what we're supposed to do. They're unaccountable. Well, what does an employee like that do? Or imagine like a police officer who sees a lot of corruption that's going on inside their agency, but they know that if they speak out, they might not be able to have a job as a police officer, some other organization. What do? Well, there are three basic ways that people respond to accountability problems inside their organization. First is to remain loyal. You remain committed to the agency, you work hard to do your best, you follow the policies and programs, you try to do the intent of the organization, you try to change the organization from the inside. Loyalty is very, very strong motivator for most of the people who go to work for government. The problem is that you can get worn down. And as you get worn down, the sense of loyalty can only last for so long before you start thinking about other potential options. One of the other options is to stand up and say, hey, this agency, this organization is out of control. Like, we are doing things that are not right. Now, that voice could happen as an internal, like, whistleblower comment. It could go as we go to the public and say, hey, I'm going to leak to the public, or I'm going to make a public statement about what's going on inside our organization. Now, when that happens, a lot of the people who go public, they're called whistleblowers. Whistleblowers take it on themselves to more or less say, hey, this agency's not doing its job right. Whistleblowers do have some protections under the law, but ultimately that has to be litigated. And so when you stand up and say something, you may receive protections, but it may be a really difficult path forward. And so people sometimes don't stand up when they see problems. Now, the last option that most people will choose at some point, if they've tried loyalty and they're afraid of voice, maybe they give up and they say, you know what, I would rather leave the agency than have to fight, have to be loyal, have to, deal with the media circus. And so they simply just leave. Now, this happens in all sorts of organizations, but particularly where there's corruption, particularly where maybe an elected official is managing an agency and the agency isn't true to what the law tells them to do. Those people get disheartened and they just simply leave. When, just as a heads up, in the future, if you start looking for jobs in a government agency or even in the private sector, and you find that the turnover rate of employees is very, very high, that's probably not a good place to start to work. So when someone comes into an administration in a government agency and people haven't been there for very long, and maybe the longest person who's been there is 4 or 5 years, you may really consider whether or not you want to join forces, because there's something internally going on inside the organization that isn't quite right. So accountability is one of those things, but ultimately employees make choices to remain loyal, to stand up and say something, or to leave. And those are good indicators about whether or not that agency is doing a good job. Now, that's all about accountability. I want to talk about ethical standards. Accountability is strictly about the law, professional standards, norms. Well, ethical standards are slightly different. In fact, I would say that they're completely different. Ethical standards are based on context and changing societal norms. Now, we want all of our government employees to be ethical. Yet when we say, what does it mean to behave ethically? People will say, well, do the right thing. Well, what does the right thing mean? The right thing in the 50s was completely different than the right thing in the 70s, which is now completely different than in the 2020s. How we treated male employees versus female employees in the 30s, 50s, 70s, 90s, 2020s is totally different. Now, something changed in the law. Maybe there have been some slight changes around the law. Mostly what's changed is what we believe is appropriate behavior. And so what happens is people who are drawn to government service want to do the very best that they can. But sometimes they may bring in from their past behavior that doesn't conform to modern ethical standards. And there's this shock that takes place as people come from the private sector into the government sector, and then all of a sudden they're saying, well, what do you mean I can't buy lunch for this regulatory official that I'm going to lunch for? We used to do that all the time in the business world. Well, we're not in the business world. And if it could even look like I'm trying to bribe a regulator with a free lunch, they won't do it. So if we have a health inspector that's coming to inspect our restaurant, and we say, here, try this food, and we get shocked, like the health inspector says, no, I can't really do that. Like, well, it's just my food. Well, yeah, but it could be construed as a gift. And a gift could mean that maybe we are exchanging favors for favors. Like, I'm going to give you a better health rating in exchange for just a bite of food. That's crazy. Well, that's the world that we live in government employment. And that's a standard that's based on ethical standards that will change over time. Now, ethical standards exist from pre-hiring through employment and potentially until death. That's to say, if I retire as a county sheriff, and then later I'm convicted of a pornography-related offense or something odd like that, they'll be like, the mass public will say, well, he worked for 35 years as a deputy sheriff. He should know better. Because there's this moral obligation, this ethical obligation for government employees that is just simply higher than in the private sector. Now, that also means that they'll do background checks to make sure that if you ran with a group of people who dealt drugs, or that you were working with hackers before you were employed, like, maybe that's okay as a 16, 17, 18-year-old, but really, if you are going to be assigned to do computer work and hacking was in your background, and they think that it maybe was malicious, they may ask you to never work on a hacking case. If you are hanging with people who used or dealt drugs, you may never be assigned as a police officer to a drug enforcement squad. You think, well, that's stupid. Well, no. That's to guarantee the integrity of the government. Now, if, for example, we have to make decisions that are going to affect us individually or personally, we often are asked to recuse ourselves from those decision-making processes. Imagine that I own a couple pieces of land in town and I work for the planning department. Well, if there's going to be a planning or a zone change that's going to affect my property, I should not be involved in that decision. Even if it's going to negatively impact me, the fact that I'm in there and I have a vested interest, a vested personal interest in that, not against the law to make a public decision to do that, but it violates an ethical standard. And so I would recuse myself. I would say, I just can't make that decision. Let's give that to somebody else who doesn't have any context, any connection with what's going on there. Now that makes sometimes recruiting people to government service very difficult, because we have to hire people with good skills, who are smart, who have like unbelievable desire and drive to do what's right, who have, you know, the capacity to serve and are willing to take the lower pay. But they may have something in their past that might violate an ethical standard. That's difficult for us. Now, ultimately, the reason that both accountability and ethical behavior matter so much is that the government isn't just an entity unto itself. It's that the government is full of people who make decisions. We need to hire good people who will be held to the standard of accountability, who will be held to high ethical behavior. In fact, George H.W. Bush called government service the highest and noblest calling. And Barack Obama said his goal was to make government and public service cool again. Like, we don't think about police officers as cool in that way, or we don't think about people who work in the DMV as like high and noble calling. You know, we might reserve that for a doctor who's saving somebody's life. But like, we definitely wouldn't call people from the IRS, you know, high, noble people. But the problem is they have been given an amazing task to implement the law in a clear, accountable, ethically high standards, efficient, equitable way. And gosh, that's hard. It's a very, very promising, a very fulfilling vocation. Like, I love being a professor. I love being able to engage with people, to provide that service, help people think critically. As a government employee, I have to have high levels of accountability and ethical behavior. And there are things that I probably couldn't do that other professors might do or other government employees might do, but I get to make a difference in somebody's life. When you're a social worker working for a county agency, you are making a difference in somebody's life. That means, though, that because we pay you with government money and we give you authority to impact these people's lives, we need to hold you accountable. And that can be a great experience, but it comes with some strings. And those big strings are accountability and ethical behavior. Now, it requires striking a balance. We need people who are good, who can be accountable, who can be ethical. But at the same time, we need people who can take risks and move us forward and make good decisions. They have to have this balance of being able to make good decisions that are based on truth and fact and good practice, but maybe push the envelope, because in the private sector, people are pushing the envelope all the time, and they're innovating and they're discovering and they're helping it become much more efficient and maybe provide better services. But because the law gives us power to do what we can do, we can only do what the law tells us. Well, can we do that in a creative way that isn't going to violate one of these standards? Well, that's difficult. And it's important to what we do is say, we did this thing for this purpose, we behaved in this way to meet some result, and we have to tie the behavior of the individuals in that organization with the results that they produce, which is kind of hard to do. What we've focused on is mostly accountability. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is do the job of government. The job of government is to implement the law that's been passed by representatives, that have been elected by you, by citizens. As citizens give power to representatives, representatives empower the law empowers agencies, agencies go to do the work of the job, to do the work of the law, to implement the law in an equitable manner. Well, that means we have to hold them accountable because we give them power, we gave them government resources, and ultimately it's us, it's our government. So we have to do these things in a way that holds up high standards so that we can meet the demands of the public.